Somewhere tonight, a small paper lantern is set loose on a dark river. It does not race the others drifting beside it. It only asks to be carried, at its own quiet pace, toward the same distant sea. Picture the water at night, black and unhurried, catching faint light from a moon you cannot quite see through the mist. Along its banks, hundreds of small lanterns have been set adrift tonight, one after another, each one carrying someone's quiet wish out into the dark current, each one moving at a speed that belongs only to itself. Some lanterns move quickly, swept along by a current that seems to favor them without any effort at all. Others drift sideways, catch for a while on the reeds near the bank, seem to fall behind the rest of the small fleet. If you have ever watched someone else's life move faster than yours and felt a small, private ache you did not quite know how to name, you already know this river. You have stood on its bank before. If that feeling has ever visited you, quietly, late at night, take a moment now to type one word below that describes it. You do not need to explain anything further. One word is enough for tonight. I will admit something to you. There was a year I stopped opening messages from old classmates, because each one felt like proof that I was standing still while everyone else moved steadily forward. It took me a long time, and a few quiet nights of my own, to understand that the river was never keeping score of any of us. I only thought it was. Tonight we set 11 of these lanterns on the water together, drawn from the quiet corners of Zen monasteries, from ordinary lives lived out in old river towns and mountain villages, and from a handful of teachers whose names history barely kept. Some of these movements carry one story, and some carry two, each one loosening a different thread of this particular ache, the very one that whispers you have somehow fallen behind everybody else. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. So let your body settle now, wherever you happen to be lying. Let your shoulders sink a little heavier into whatever is holding you tonight. There is nowhere you are required to arrive by morning, and nothing here you must catch up on before you sleep. Just this river, this soft, dark, and the small lantern of your own breath, moving at exactly the pace it was always meant to move. And as the last small light drifted from view around the bend of that dark river, another evening had already begun to settle somewhere else entirely, on a much older river, half a world and many lifetimes away. There, too, someone was watching boats go by and wondering, without quite admitting it to himself, whether he had spent his whole life standing at the same worn dock while everyone else went somewhere. Perhaps you know this feeling better than you would like to. You are lying in the dark tonight, and somewhere in the last day or two, without meaning to, you opened a screen filled with someone else's good news, to someone else's wedding, someone else's new position, someone else's home with the light on in every window, and something in your chest went quiet and heavy at the same time. You did not begrudge them any of it. You simply felt, for a moment, very far behind. You closed the screen and lay there afterward doing the quiet arithmetic almost everyone does at some point, comparing the year you have actually lived to the year you privately believed you were owed by now. You have wondered if there is a schedule everyone else received that somehow never reached you. A schedule other people seem to be keeping without even trying, while you are still checking the same page over and over, unsure what step you are meant to be on. There is an old teaching that says suffering is often not caused by what is happening to us, but by the story the mind tells about where we are supposed to be by now. A story that keeps a private ledger of arrivals and departures no outer life could ever satisfy. Long ago, on a river outside a city that would one day be called Edo, a young ferryman discovered this without ever hearing it put into words at all. His name was Ren, and the temple bell across the water sounded thin and far off as the light began to fail. Nearer, the calls of boatmen selling the last of their firewood rose and fell along the bank, unhurried, already turning toward home. And closest of all, beneath Ren's bare feet, the worn planks of his small ferry were still warm from the day's sun, the grain of the wood familiar under his soles, the way it had been every evening for 3 years. Would he ever cross to somewhere new? Ren sometimes wondered. Or would he spend his whole life going back and forth over the same short stretch of water, never arriving anywhere at all? Every evening he watched the same procession pass him by on the wider channel beyond his own short crossing. Rice boats low in the water, headed for the great markets near the city center. A merchant's private boat, lacquered and swift, its owner smoking a long pipe beneath a striped awning, while a servant fanned the smoke away from his face. Fishing boats returning with the tide, their catch already promised to someone waiting downstream who would sell it on again by morning. A boat of pilgrims singing softly, bound for a shrine 3 towns away, their voices carrying strangely far over the flat evening water. All of them going somewhere. All of them, in Ren's eyes, becoming something more than what they had been that morning, shedding one shore and reaching for another. Their whole lives, a visible line of progress that anyone standing on the bank could trace with a finger. His own ferry only ever went from this bank to that one, a short stretch of water he had crossed so many times he could have poled it with his eyes closed. Back and forth, back and forth. The same crossing he had worked since he was a boy of 14, watching everyone else's river carry them somewhere he was apparently never meant to go. That evening, as he tied up for what he thought was the last crossing of the day, an old woman came hurrying down the bank, calling for him to wait. He knew her. She took his ferry every single evening at this same hour, to visit the small shrine on the far bank where her husband's ashes had been kept for 11 years. He held the boat steady while she settled herself, and as he pushed off, something in him spoke before he had decided to let it. "You must think this a poor sort of life," he said, not quite looking at her, poling the same water every evening while the big boats go on to make their fortunes somewhere past the bend. The old woman was quiet for a moment, watching the lanterns being lit one by one on the boats further out. "Do you know why I take your ferry every evening?" she said, "and not one of those swift boats that could carry me across twice as fast?" "Because mine is smaller," Ren said. "Because it costs less." "Because you are always here," she said. "Every evening, at this hour, at this bank, you are exactly where the water needs crossing. Those large boats are never here when I need them. They are always somewhere else, becoming something else, on their way to some other shore. You are the only one on this whole river who has nowhere else he is trying to be." "That sounds like a kind way of saying I have gone nowhere in 3 years," Ren said, and he was surprised by how much it stung to say it aloud. "Or it is an honest way of saying you have been faithful to one small place for 3 years, she said, "which is rarer than going somewhere, and harder to keep doing, and not the same failure you have decided it is." She looked out at the lanterns being lit on the distant boats and did not say anything further for a while. Ren said nothing either. He only pulled them across, the water dark and unhurried beneath the hull. The sound of it against the wood, the only reply he had. He had expected an answer that made his crossing sound small. Instead, it had made it sound like the one steady thing on the entire river. When he returned alone that evening, he did not glance downstream after the rice boats and their lanterns the way he usually did. He watched. Instead, as one by one they lit small paper lanterns at their bows and pushed on into the dark, further and further from any shore that could be called their own for the night, never once coming fully to rest. The pilgrim boat's singing grew fainter as it rounded the bend, still traveling, still becoming, still somewhere between one place and another. His own small ferry, meanwhile, sat already still against the bank, its work for the day entirely finished, complete in a way none of those distant lanterns yet were. The river did not care that his boat went nowhere. It only asked that he meet it, evening after evening, exactly where it was. He tied the final knot at the mooring post, feeling the old rope rough and familiar under his palm, worn smooth in the same places his hands always found it. For the first time in a long while, he did not stand and check to see how far downstream the other lanterns had traveled before he turned toward home. He simply latched the boat, listened to the water settle against the hull the way it did every night at this hour, and let that be enough. Somewhere far off, in a monastery hidden in the hills beyond the city, a young man his own age lay awake that same night on a hard sleeping mat, certain that his own brothers in practice were outpacing him towards something he had not yet reached, and had no old woman yet to tell him otherwise. You may have carried something like Ren's ache for a long time without a name for it, watching from wherever you have been standing, as other lives seem to move and arrive and become, while yours held its position. Perhaps you called it falling behind. Perhaps you called it being stuck. Perhaps you never called it anything at all, and only felt it, again and again, as a small private weight each time someone else's news reached you before your own had even begun to form. What was Ren actually holding underneath the comparison? Not simply a wish to travel further, but a belief, older than the feeling itself, that arrival was the only proof a life was working. That unless something visibly changed, unless a shore was reached and a new one chosen, the days were somehow being wasted. This is the part almost no one says aloud, because it sounds foolish, stated plainly, and yet nearly everyone carries some version of it quietly. The way Ren carried his, without ever once naming it while it ran his evenings. There is a teaching, very old, that lists effort among the qualities that ripen a mind toward peace, and it is worth noticing that this quality is never described there as speed. It is described as steadiness, the willingness to return to the same work, the same water, the same evening crossing, again and again, without needing to have gone anywhere new by morning. The teaching does not measure a life by the distance it has traveled. It measures a life by how faithfully it has shown up to the place it is actually needed. What Ren had been holding, without knowing its name, was the belief that stillness and failure were the same thing. That if his life was not visibly moving toward some new shore, it could not be counting for anything at all. This is a very old and very common ache, and it rarely announces itself so plainly. It usually arrives disguised as a scrolling thumb at midnight, as a private, wordless flinch when an old friend's life appears to have gone further than yours. as the quiet subtraction you do without meaning to, measuring your unfinished chapters against everyone else's finished ones. Perhaps tonight you are the one still lying there with a small pale light in your face, watching someone else's boat pull further ahead, feeling the current move around you while you stay fixed at your own quiet mooring. Perhaps it is a friend's wedding, or a colleague's promotion, or simply the ordinary sight of a life that appears to be further along than yours feels tonight. If so, you are permitted to remember what the old woman told Wren. In whatever words fit your own life best tonight, you are always here. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. The large boats are never where they are needed. They are always becoming something else, somewhere else. And they are never, not once, fully at rest the way you are allowed to be right now. You are the one who is here, exactly here. And being here, fully and reliably here, has never once been the same as being left behind. You are already here. Let that phrase settle for a moment. The way water settles once a boat has stopped disturbing it. You are already here. Not almost here. Not on your way to being here eventually, once certain things fall into place. Already here, tonight, in this bed, in this body, in this exact unfinished, unglamorous, entirely sufficient moment. Let that settle into your shoulders now, the way the evening settled over Wren's small ferry once the last lantern had drifted out of sight. There is nothing you are required to catch up to tonight. Let your jaw soften. Unclench from wherever it has been holding the day. Let your hands, wherever they are resting, stop gripping toward whatever shore you thought you needed to reach by now. Let your feet grow heavy, the way tired feet grow heavy at the end of a long day of standing at your own particular post. Feel the weight of your body sinking a little further into whatever is holding you tonight. The mattress, the pillow, the quiet dark of the room around you. You do not need to solve anything before you sleep. You do not need to close the distance between your life and anyone else's before you are allowed to rest. Nothing you have not yet arrived at needs deciding tonight. The mooring is not a failure. The mooring is simply where you are, and the water, patient and dark and unhurried, will still be here in the morning, exactly where it always is, ready to be crossed again, in its own time, at its own pace. You can rest now. There is nowhere else you need to be. Somewhere else tonight. Someone is still lying awake, counting other people's distance, instead of resting inside their own. You do not have to join them. You can simply let your breathing slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and drift, the way a small boat drifts when it is finally allowed to stop. Its rope wound loosely around a familiar post. Its work for tonight already, completely done. That same feeling of being outpaced does not only live on riverbanks and ferry docks. It lives in kitchens, too, and in meditation halls, and in any place where one person quietly measures the distance between where they are and where someone else seems to have already arrived. Long before anyone thought to compare a life to a boat, there was a young man who tended fires for a living, and was certain the fire was the only thing about him that would ever be considered warm or promising. You may know this particular flavor of the ache. It is not only watching someone else's whole life move ahead of yours, the way a boat pulls ahead on open water. Sometimes it is smaller and sharper than that. The sting of sitting in a room with people who seem to simply understand things faster than you do. who ask the sharp question you are still forming, who arrive at the insight while you are still reading the first page. You leave the room telling yourself it does not matter, and some part of you keeps score anyway, certain that everyone else in that room is somehow further along a path you cannot even clearly see, further along in confidence, in cleverness, in whatever quiet currency that room happened to be trading in that day. You go home replaying your own hesitation, editing it, wondering what a quicker mind would have said instead. There is a teaching that says the mind, left alone, will always find a way to rank itself against whoever is nearest, and that this ranking is almost never accurate, because it measures what can be seen and ignores what cannot. In a mountain monastery in China, during the early years of the 9th century, a young monk who tended the kitchen fires learned something about this from his own teacher, in a moment that had nothing to do with rank at all. His name was Ling Yu, and from the kitchen where he worked, the temple bells sounded close and heavy at the top of every hour. Nearer than the bell, the low murmur of Dharma brothers debating a famous teaching carried through the thin wall from the meditation hall. And closest of all, beneath Ling Yu's hands, the coals in the hearth glowed faint orange in the growing dark, needing to be tended before they went out completely. Would he ever be seen as anything more than the one who kept the fire going while the others reached toward wisdom? Ling Yu sometimes wondered, alone in the kitchen, at the hour when the debates in the hall grew loudest. One of the younger monks passed the kitchen doorway that evening, still flushed from the discussion inside, still at the hearth. "Ling Yu," he said, not unkindly, only distracted. "We have been turning over the case of the wild fox for 2 hours now. Master Baizhang says none of us have understood it yet, though Huiji came close." "Then you are further along than I am tonight," Ling Yu said, keeping his eyes on the coals, and meant it as simply as it sounded, though something in his chest tightened around the words. Later that night, when the debating had quieted and most of the monastery had gone to sleep, Baizhang himself appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Ling Yu," he said, "is there fire in the hearth?" Ling Yu rose at once and crouched by the hearth, stirring through the ash with the iron poker, searching the way he always searched, quickly, the way a man searches when his mind is elsewhere, still turning over the younger monk's words from the doorway. He found only grey ash, cold to the touch. "There is no fire, Master," he said. "It has gone out completely." Baizhang did not answer right away. He crossed the room himself, knelt at the hearth, and stirred the same ashes Ling Yu had just searched. Deep beneath the grey surface, he uncovered a single small ember, still glowing, still alive. He lifted it toward Ling Yu on the end of the poker. "You say there is no fire," he said. "What do you call this?" Ling Yu said nothing. He only looked at the small orange light in the dark kitchen, no larger than the first spark of a lantern, and understood, without being told, that the fire had never gone out. Only his looking had grown careless, the way attention grows careless whenever it is busy measuring itself against someone else's flame, instead of resting where it actually is. He bowed low to his teacher, and Baizhang said nothing further, only handed him the poker and returned to his own quarters, leaving Ling Yu alone with the hearth and the small stubborn ember that had been there the entire time. In the days that followed, Ling Yu returned to his kitchen duties without the same tight ache behind his ribs whenever the sound of debate carried through the wall. He still could not answer the case of the wild fox, and it no longer seemed urgent that he should be able to. He tended the fire the way he had always tended it, except now he actually looked at it while he worked. And some evenings, watching the coals glow low and steady in the dark kitchen, he thought they resembled nothing so much as a small string of lanterns, set adrift, quietly keeping their own light going long after anyone had stopped watching them. Perhaps you have searched through your own ashes the way Ling Yu first did, quickly, distractedly, already certain of what you would find before you had actually looked. Perhaps you have decided, the way he almost decided, that whatever warmth or promise you carry has already gone out, simply because you were comparing your search to someone else's fire the entire time you were searching, instead of tending your own with any real attention at all. What Ling Yu had been holding underneath his tiredness that evening was the quiet belief that being useful in an ordinary, unglamorous way could never be the same as being advanced. That tending a fire was somehow a lesser kind of practice than debating a famous teaching in a warm, crowded hall. This belief rarely says itself so plainly. It usually arrives disguised as exhaustion at the end of an ordinary day, as the specific ache of watching people you respect discuss something you feel you should already understand, as the reflex to apologize for work that is quiet and unseen, as though quiet and unseen were the same thing as unimportant. There is an old teaching that our attention becomes accurate only when it stops comparing itself to the attention of others, that a mind busy measuring distance to a neighboring flame cannot properly tend its own. Ling Yu did not become wiser than his Dharma brothers that night. He simply stopped searching for fire with a mind that was somewhere else entirely, and found, once he looked properly, that the fire he needed had been there all along, waiting only to be seen, without the noise of comparison layered over it. You are permitted to search your own hearth a little more slowly tonight. Whatever warmth you have been certain has gone out, in your work, in your patience, in your ordinary unglamorous days, may still be resting quietly beneath a surface that only looked cold because you were checking it in a hurry, your attention borrowed by someone else's fire the whole time. Some months after that quiet evening in the kitchen, word spread through the monastery that Baizhang intended to found a new mountain temple, and that he would choose its abbot from among his own students. Nearly everyone assumed the choice would fall to the head monk, a brilliant and precise young scholar who had answered every difficult question Baizhang had posed for years, including, at last, the case of the wild fox. "It will surely be the head monk," one of the younger brothers whispered to Ling Yu as they gathered in the hall. "He has never once been beaten to an answer." "Then I hope the mountain suits him," Ling Yu said, and found that he meant this too, without the old tightness in his chest. Baizhang set a plain water jug on the floor in front of the assembly. "You cannot call this a water bottle," he said. "What do you call it?" The head monk stepped forward first, as everyone had expected he would, and answered with the kind of precision that had won him every debate that year. "You cannot call it a wooden sandal," he said, and a murmur of approval passed through the hall. Baizhang turned to Ling Yu, still standing near the back, closer to the kitchen than to the front of the hall, as always. "And you, cook, what do you call it?" Ling Yu did not answer in words at all. He walked forward, tipped the jug over with the side of his foot, and walked out of the hall without looking back, leaving the water spreading quietly across the floor behind him. Baizhang laughed, a short, warm sound that startled the whole assembly. "The head monk has lost to the cook," he said, and that was how it was decided. "Ling Yu, who had spent his years at the monastery believing himself to be the one furthest from advancement, was given the new mountain and its temple, while the head monk, still turning the water bottle question over in his mind that night, wondered, quietly, what he had failed to see. Two men were asked the exact same question. One reached for the correct-sounding answer, the clever answer, the answer built to prove he had understood something the others had not yet grasped. The other simply responded to what was actually in front of him, without needing the response to prove anything about where he stood. It was not that Lingyu was further along a hidden path than the head monk. It was that only one of them was still trying to be seen as ahead. And that effort was the only real distance between them. A distance neither of them could have measured while it was happening. This does not mean cleverness is a fault, or that trying hard is a mistake. It means that somewhere beneath most striving to appear advanced, there is a quieter kind of attention available the whole time, one that responds to the moment in front of it instead of to the audience watching. Lingyu did not out-argue anyone that day. He simply was not, in that particular moment, comparing himself to anyone at all, and the water bottle, tipped over by a foot instead of answered with a clever phrase, needed nothing more from him than that. The kitchen fire and the water bottle are not two different teachings. When you look at them closely enough, both were asking the same quiet question, in different rooms, on different nights. Not who was ahead, not who has understood the most. Only what is actually here, right now, in front of you, and are you looking at it clearly enough to see it? The head monk returned to his own quarters that night and, it is said, could not sleep, turning the water bottle question over and over, certain there had been a more correct answer he had simply not yet found, already composing, in the dark, the sharper reply he would give if only he were asked again. Let your own hands rest now, wherever they are, open instead of reaching for a sharper answer. There is no assembly waiting to hear from you tonight, no hall full of Dharma brothers keeping score of who understood the case first. Let your shoulders lower. The way Lingyu's did once he stopped needing the fire in front of him to prove anything about the fire in anyone else's hearth. Let your forehead smooth. The small furrow that gathers there whenever the mind is composing a sharper reply to someone who is not even in the room. You do not have to out-argue your own tiredness tonight. You do not have to arrive at the sharper answer, the more advanced answer, before you are allowed to rest. Whatever question your mind has been quietly turning over, the way the head monk turned his over long into the night, you can set it down now, unanswered, and let that be entirely permitted. There will be no assembly gathering to hear your response in the morning either. There is only this bed, this breath, this ordinary, unglamorous night, which needs nothing further proven about it before it is allowed to hold you. Feel the weight of your body settling further into stillness, the mattress or the cushion beneath you receiving whatever you set down. Let your legs grow heavy, the small tension in them draining away the way heat drains slowly from a coal no one is fanning. Feel the small ember of your own attention needing nothing more from you tonight than to be looked at gently, without comparison, without hurry, without an audience keeping score. Somewhere, another mind is still awake, still composing its sharper reply, still certain that whoever answered first must somehow have understood more. You do not have to join it. You can simply let your eyes close and rest, the way a fire rests once no one is asking it to prove how brightly it can burn. And no one, not even you, is checking to see how far behind or ahead of anyone else it has become. The head monk was not the only one that night who lay awake, composing a sharper answer for a question no one had actually asked him twice. In monasteries scattered across centuries and countries, this same quiet arithmetic has gone on in the dark, long after the candles were put out, long after anyone else in the room had any idea a contest was even taking place, long after the person supposedly winning it had already fallen asleep, entirely unaware they had been entered into anything at all. You may have run a version of this same private race yourself, against someone who never once agreed to enter it, a sibling whose life you have quietly measured your own against since childhood, a colleague whose calm in a meeting you noted and filed away, then compared, unfavorably, to your own racing pulse, a friend whose apparent ease with things you find difficult has become, without your ever choosing it, the ruler by which you measure your own worth on a given day. Perhaps it is someone at your own table, someone you love, whose patience with a difficult morning seems to arrive so easily while yours has to be assembled, piece by piece, out of gritted teeth and deep breaths. They do not know they are being measured. That is often what makes it ache the way it does. You would never say any of this aloud, and you may have never even said it clearly to yourself, and yet some quiet part of you has been keeping the tally anyway. Night after night, comparing your visible effort to their apparent ease. There is a teaching that most suffering of this kind is not caused by the other person at all, who is simply living their own life, unaware they have been entered into anyone's contest. It is caused by the quiet, tireless watcher inside the mind who keeps the tally, who is almost never noticed directly, because it is always so busy looking at everyone else instead of at itself. In a mountain temple in Kai province, in the Japanese highlands, during the middle years of the 14th century, a young monk was taught to turn around and look at that watcher directly for the first time, and found, to his surprise, that it had been the most exhausted thing in the entire room all along. Wind moved through the pines above the temple roof, a long, low sound that had been there since before the building itself. Nearer, the soft rustle of a dozen robes settling into stillness filled the meditation hall as the monks took their places for the morning sitting. And closest of all, Genko felt his own knee, cold and aching against the thin mat beneath him, shifting for the third time that morning while the hall around him grew quiet. Would he ever sit as still as the others? Genko wondered. Or would his own mind always be the one still moving, the one falling quietly behind everyone else in the room? No matter how many years he stayed, Genko had been at the temple 2 years, training under the teacher Basui, who taught almost nothing except a single relentless question, returned to again and again in every private meeting until the students grew tired of hearing it and eventually could not stop asking it of themselves. But Genko's attention that morning was not on the question at all. It had drifted, as it often did, to the monk seated 2 mats away. A young man named Shuntai, who had joined the temple the same season as Genko and who had, in Genko's private accounting, been sitting more still, breathing more evenly, and answering the teacher's questions more cleanly ever since. Genko did not mean to watch him. His eyes simply found Shuntai's straight back and folded hands the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, again and again, cataloguing the evidence. Shuntai has not shifted once this morning. Shuntai's shoulders are perfectly level. Shuntai answered yesterday's question without hesitating, and I am still turning it over now. It had become, over the past season, an entire private ledger, kept without paper or ink, updated every morning in the hall, every evening at the meal, every time the teacher's eyes seemed to rest a fraction longer on Shuntai's answer than they had on Genko's own. Genko could have told you, if anyone had asked, exactly how many mornings in the last month Shuntai had risen before the bell, and exactly how many mornings he himself had not. At the end of the sitting, Basui called Genko to stay behind while the others filed out for their morning meal. He did not sit down across from him the way he usually did for private instruction. He simply stood at the window, looking out at the pines, and said, "Your eyes were not on your own breath just now." Genko felt his face grow warm. "I was watching Shuntai," he admitted. "He has not moved in an hour. I have shifted 3 times already this morning, and I could not seem to stop counting the difference." "And who was doing the watching?" Basui asked, still facing the window. "I don't understand," Genko said. "The one who noticed Shuntai's stillness. The one who counted your own shifting, and compared the two, and found you wanting. Who is that one?" Basui turned from the window now, and his voice was not unkind, only very direct. "Find him. Look for him the way you would look for a stranger who had wandered into the hall uninvited. I promise you, whoever he is far more restless than your knees will ever be." "But surely some of it is true," Genko said, unable to stop himself. "Shuntai really has not moved in an hour. I really have shifted 3 times. These are not things I invented." "Both of those things may be true," Basui said, "and neither of them requires the accountant you have hired to keep comparing them. Shuntai's stillness belongs to Shuntai. Your shifting belongs to you. The moment you set them side by side and call one of them a verdict, you have left your own cushion entirely and gone to stand somewhere between the two of you, which is nowhere at all." Genko opened his mouth to answer and found he had nothing to say. He had never once turned to look at the one doing the measuring. He had only ever looked at what was being measured. He returned to his cushion for the evening, sitting still, uncertain what he was searching for. But when his eyes began, out of old habit, to drift toward Shuntai's straight back, he caught the drifting itself this time. He felt the small tug of comparison starting up like a familiar itch, and simply asked, silently, the way Basui had taught him who was noticing this, "Who is keeping this particular tally, and what does he actually look like?" If you turn and try to find him directly, there was no answer. There was only the wind in the pines, and his own knee, and the peculiar discovery that the watcher, examined directly, seemed to have nowhere solid to stand at all. It was not that Genko became still like Shuntai that evening. He shifted 2 more before the bell, but something in the shifting had grown lighter, emptied of the old private scorekeeping that had made each small movement feel like a verdict on his whole practice. He noticed, too, that Shuntai's stillness, looked at without the ledger attached to it, was simply Shuntai's stillness, a plain fact about another young man's body on a particular evening, carrying no message at all about Genko's own worth. Around the hall, some monks had settled, like small boats coming untied and drifting exactly where the current wished to take them. Others, Genko among them, until that evening, had held themselves rigid against banks that were never actually there, straining toward a stillness borrowed from someone else's shoulders instead of resting in their own uneven breath. By the time the closing bell sounded, Genko had stopped counting his own shifts entirely. Not because he had finally sat as still as he wished, but because the counting itself had quietly run out of a watcher willing to keep it going, and no new tally had yet risen to take its place. You may carry a version of Genko's watcher yourself, one you have never turned to look at directly, because it is always too occupied cataloguing someone else's evenness, someone else's calm, someone else's apparent ease with the very things that cost you so much effort. It rarely introduces itself by name. It simply narrates, quietly and constantly. In comparisons, they have not moved in an hour, and I have shifted 3 times already. They rose before the bell again, and I could not. What Genko had been holding, without knowing its shape, was not really a judgment about Shuntai at all. It was a tireless inner accountant who needed someone else's stillness in order to measure his own supposed restlessness, and who would have found a new person to measure against the very next morning, and the morning after that, for as long as it was allowed to keep working unexamined. Even if Shuntai had left the temple entirely, some part of Genko understood. The accountant would simply have turned its ledger toward the next monk who happened to sit nearby, because the watching was never really about Shuntai. It was about needing someone, anyone, to serve as the fixed point against which the self could be measured and, almost always, found lacking. There is an old teaching, at the very center of some traditions, that asks simply, who is the one who sees, and hears, and keeps score? Not to answer the question quickly, only to turn toward it, the way Genko finally did, and notice that the watcher, looked at directly, is far less solid and far less certain of its own comparisons than it ever sounds while it is running quietly in the background of an ordinary day. The mind that keeps such careful count of everyone else's stillness turns out, on close inspection, to be the single most restless thing in the entire room. Tonight, if you notice that same old watcher beginning its familiar tally, comparing your evening to someone else's, your patience to someone else's calm, your progress to someone else's ease, you do not have to argue with it or silence it. You can simply turn, gently, the way Genko learned to turn, and ask what it is, exactly, that is doing all this counting. You may find, as he did, that it has less ground to stand on than it has ever let on, and that whatever it was so afraid of losing was never actually at risk to begin with. Let your knee soften now, wherever it has been holding tension against a stillness that was never actually required of you. Let your shoulders lower a little further, released from whatever comparison they have been quietly bracing against all day. Let your hands, wherever they are resting tonight, unclench from the small ledger they have been keeping without your full permission. There is no one sitting 2 mats away from you tonight, keeping a private tally of how evenly you are breathing, how quickly you fall asleep, or how easily rest seems to come to you compared to anyone else in your life. There is only your own breath, uneven or steady, exactly as it happens to be right now, needing no one's approval and no one's stillness to be sufficient. You do not have to sit as still as anyone else tonight. You do not have to out-calm a mind that was never in competition with you in the first place. If the old accountant stirs once more before you drift off, quietly comparing your evening to someone else's ease, you can simply turn toward it the way Genko learned to, gently, without argument, and let it discover, the way he did, that it has far less ground to stand on than it has ever let on. Let your whole body settle now the way a small boat settles once its rope has finally been let loose from the bank, drifting at exactly the pace that belongs to it, watched by no one, measured against no one, simply here, simply breathing, simply allowed. The wind is still moving through the pines somewhere tonight, the way it always has, needing no one to notice it, no one to count its breaths, no one to compare its stillness to anything at all. You can rest the same way. Nothing about tonight requires a witness, or a score, or a single mat set 2 lengths away. Jenko was not the only one who had mistaken someone else's stillness for something it was not. The mistake takes many shapes, in many centuries, in many trades that have nothing to do with meditation halls at all. Sometimes it wears the shape of a loom, worked late into the night by someone convinced that her own hands were the only clumsy ones on the entire lane. You may know this shape of the ache too, the particular sting of comparing your own unfinished, visibly messy effort to someone else's tidy, completed result. You see a colleague's polished presentation and forget the 4 drafts they quietly threw away before it. You see a friend's calm parenting in a single afternoon and forget you are not there for the exhausted, short-tempered mornings that came before it, the ones no one posts anywhere. You compare your rough, half-built process, seams showing, doubts still visible, to everyone else's finished performance, and the comparison is never fair, because you are the only person in it whose backstage you can actually see. You know every discarded draft of your own life. You have only ever been shown everyone else's final copy. There is a teaching that most comparison of this kind rests on a simple, almost innocent error, mistaking what is visible for what is real, and mistaking the absence of visible struggle for the absence of struggle itself. It is an easy error to make, because struggle by its nature tends to happen behind closed doors, late at night, in the 1 hour no one else is invited to witness, while results are, by their nature, the part meant to be seen. In a small weaving village in Korea, during the middle years of the 16th century, a young woman learned this by accident. On a night, she had only meant to borrow some thread. Somewhere across the fields, a dog barked twice and fell silent again. Nearer, through the thin wall separating the 2 houses, came the familiar creak of a neighboring loom, worked late as it always seemed to be. And closest of all, Yoni felt the rough, ramy thread biting into the pads of her fingers, cramped from an evening spent weaving the same 6 rows over and over, unable to make them lie the way she wanted. Would her own hands ever produce cloth fine enough to be spoken of the way Damhe's was? Yoni wondered. Or would she spend every night of her life quietly unpicking what she had only just made? Everyone in the village spoke of Damhe's weaving the way they spoke of good weather, as though it simply arrived, effortless and complete. Merchants came from 2 towns over to buy her bolts before they had even finished cooling from the loom, and the village elders had taken, over the past year, to holding her cloth up as an example to every young weaver still learning the craft. Yoni had watched her own mother hold up a length of Damhe's cloth once, running a thumb along the even weave, and say, without unkindness but without noticing the sting of it either, that some hands were simply born knowing how to do this, and some were not. Yoni had turned back to her own loom that evening and unpicked an entire row that, looked at honestly, had nothing wrong with it at all. That night, having run out of dyed thread earlier than she expected. Yoni walked the short path to Damhi's house to ask for a length to finish her row. Later than was polite to be calling on anyone, but the lamp in Damhi's window was still lit, so she knocked softly and let herself into the small courtyard. She found Damhi not asleep and not entertaining a late guest, but alone at her own loom, unpicking a long section of pale cloth with quick, frustrated movements, her face wet in the lamplight. "You're unweaving it," Yoni said, before she could stop herself. "But everyone says your cloth is the finest in the village." Damhi startled, wiping her face quickly with the back of her wrist. "They see the cloth after I have already undone the parts that shamed me," she said. "No one calls at this hour. No one has ever seen this part before." "I thought it came easily to you," Yoni said. "I thought your hands never had to pull anything apart." "I unpick something almost every night," Damhi said, a short, tired laugh escaping her. "I have simply never let anyone visit late enough to see it. Until tonight." Yoni sat down slowly on the low stool by the door, still holding the thread she had come to borrow. "Then how do you know when to stop pulling it apart and let it be enough?" "I don't. Always," Damhi admitted. "Some nights, I only stop because my eyes give out before my judgment does, and I fold the cloth away before I can find one more flaw in it." She looked at the unraveled section in her lap. "You have been comparing your loom to my finished bolts this whole time, haven't you?" Yoni did not answer right away, because the answer was written plainly enough on her face. "Every night," she finally admitted. "I thought you never had a night like this one." "I have a night like this one almost every week," Damhi said, "and I have simply become very skilled at making sure no one visits late enough to know it." She walked home with her borrowed thread a short while later, past the other lit windows along the lane, each one keeping its own hidden hours that no passerby would ever see from the road. She had been comparing her own unfinished cloth, visible thread by visible thread, to a bolt that only ever appeared in public after every doubt in it had already been quietly removed. That night, for the first time in months, she let a small uneven raft remain in her own weaving rather than pulling it out, and found that the cloth, imperfect and entirely hers, was still cloth, still warm, still worth the hours it had taken. Perhaps you have made the same comparison Yoni made, holding your own unfinished evening, your own uneven rows, up against someone else's cloth that has already been folded and displayed for the market. You saw only the finished bolt. You never once saw the hour before, spent unpicking, alone, by lamplight, doubting the very thing that would later be admired. What Yoni had been holding, without quite naming it, was the belief that some people are simply given fine, effortless hands, and others are given clumsy ones, when the truer account, hidden behind every closed door on that lane, was that nearly everyone was unpicking something almost every night, and simply choosing, out of habit or shame, never to be visited late enough for anyone to see it. Some months later, an old Zen teacher on the other side of the world would tell a frightened young student almost the same thing, though neither of them would ever hear of a village weaver named Yoni or the cloth she finally let herself keep. He was called Hakuin, and by the time this particular student came to him, late one evening at Shoinji Temple, he had already spent decades being spoken of. The way Yoni's whole village once spoke of Damhi, as though his calm had simply arrived in him, effortless and complete, requiring nothing to be unpicked or admitted. Students traveled from other provinces to sit near him. Younger monks repeated his sayings to each other, the way Yoni's mother had once repeated the evenness of Damhi's weave. "I have been here 3 years, Master," the young monk said, unable to keep the frustration from his voice. "And I still cannot sit through a single evening without my mind circling like a dog chasing something it will never catch." "You never seem troubled at all." Hakuin was quiet for a moment, folding his hands in his lap. "You did not know me 40 years ago," he said, finally. "What do you mean?" "For years, I could not sleep. My heart raced, for no reason I could name. I grew so afraid of my own mind that I traveled the length of the country searching for anyone who could tell me how to be free of it, and found, for a long while, no one who could." Hakuin's voice stayed even, almost matter of fact, the way a person describes weather from long ago. "An old hermit in the mountains finally taught me a method for settling what had become unsettled in me. It took years more before I trusted it, and years after that before it stopped feeling like something I had to hold on to with both hands. You have only known me on the other side of all of that." The young monk stared at him. "You never speak of this in your lectures. Would it have helped you 3 years ago to hear how frightened I once was, before you had learned to trust even your own breath?" Hakuin asked. "Because by the time students meet me, the worst of it is already finished. The way a bolt of fine cloth carries no sign of the nights. Someone spent quietly undoing it before it was ever shown to anyone." The young monk sat with this for a long while, the lamp between them burning low. He had spent 3 years measuring his own circling, unsettled mind against a stillness he believed his teacher had simply always possessed, never once suspecting that the stillness itself had once been unpicked, over and over, by hands every bit as frightened as his own. Yoni believed Damhi's hands had never once had to pull anything apart. The young monk believed Hakuin's mind had never once raced the way his own did every evening. Both of them were comparing their own unfinished process to someone else's finished performance, and mistaking the absence of visible struggle for the absence of struggle itself, when the truer teaching, hidden behind nearly every calm face and every fine bolt of cloth, is that almost no one arrives anywhere without a great deal of quiet, unpicking that no one else was ever meant to see. This does not mean every visible calm is false, or that every fine result should be doubted. Damhi's cloth really was fine. Hakuin's stillness, by the time the young monk sat before him, really was steady. It means only that the comparison itself, the one that measures your own raw, half-finished evening against someone else's completed, displayed one, was never a fair measure to begin with, because you were never shown the part of their process that would have made the comparison honest. The finished bolt and the settled teacher are not lies. They are simply the very last part of a much longer, much messier story, arriving in your view only after every hour that would have made it feel less impossible had already been quietly spent, alone, by someone who never once thought to mention it. Wherever you are tonight, holding your own unfinished rose up against someone else's admired cloth, someone else's apparent calm, you are permitted to remember that you are only seeing what has already been shown, and never the lamp still burning quietly behind a door further down the lane, where someone else is unpicking something of their own. Let your hands rest now, wherever they are, no longer needing to pull apart what has already been honestly made. Let your shoulders lower, released from the weight of a comparison that was never fair from the start. Let your jaw soften too, unclench from whatever quiet judgment it has been holding against your own unfinished rose. There is no bolt of cloth waiting to be judged tonight, no lecture hall keeping score of how calm your evening has been. No merchant standing at the door, checking the evenness of your weave before he decides whether your day was worth anything at all. You do not have to finish unpicking anything else before you are allowed to rest. Whatever is uneven in your own row tonight, whatever draft of your own life still shows its seams, can simply remain imperfect and entirely yours, still warm, still worth the hours it took, is still cloth, even with its flaws, left visibly in it. Feel your legs grow heavy, the way tired legs grow heavy after a long day spent quietly comparing an unfinished morning to someone else's finished one. Feel that weight settling now, unhurried, into whatever is holding you. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and let your whole body settle the way a length of cloth settles once it has finally been folded and set down for the night, with all its small, honest unevenness still woven quietly into it. Somewhere down the lane, another small lamp is still burning, someone else quietly unpicking something of their own, and they do not need you awake to keep them company. You are permitted to fold your own evening away now, exactly as it is, and rest. The young monk, who once measured his own racing mind against his teacher's stillness, eventually fell asleep that night, still turning the question over. But there is a further turning available beyond simply forgiving yourself for comparing, a turning where the comparison itself quietly stops making sense at all. The way a race stops mattering the moment you notice there was never actually a finish line waiting at the other end of it. You have spent several nights now, perhaps, softening the sting of feeling behind, learning to be gentler with your own uneven pace, learning that the person you envied was carrying something hidden too. Tonight is for something a little different. Not softening the ache of the race, but looking directly at the race itself, the way you might finally look straight at a shape you have been avoiding out of the corner of your eye for years, only to find there was no shape there at all, only water, moving the way water moves, indifferent to any line anyone had once drawn across it. There is a teaching that what we search for so urgently outside ourselves, in someone else's pace, someone else's certainty, someone else's apparent arrival, can never actually be found there, because it was never separate from us to begin with. It is a difficult teaching to trust while you are still in the middle of searching, because the searching itself feels so much like proof that the thing must be findable somewhere, in someone. A Chan monk in 9th century China discovered this while doing nothing more unusual than crossing a shallow stream on an ordinary afternoon. His name was Dongshan, and for years after his own teacher Yunyan had died, he had carried one unfinished exchange between them like a stone in his sleeve, turning it over on every road he walked, in every temple guest house he slept in every conversation that touched even lightly on the nature of understanding. Other monks he met on his travels spoke of their own realizations with an ease that made his own uncertainty feel, by comparison, like a kind of failure he could not name, a private slowness he was careful never to mention aloud. Would he ever arrive at whatever it was the other monks seemed already to possess? Dongshan sometimes wondered. Or would he spend the rest of his life carrying an unanswered question from a teacher who was no longer there to explain it? watching everyone else's certainty arrive while his own remained stubbornly, quietly unfinished. He was traveling that season with a Dharma brother named Shen Shan, the two of them following back roads between one monastery and the next, neither in any particular hurry, though Dongshan's mind rarely felt unhurried at all. "You are somewhere else again," Shen Shan said, as they walked. "You have been somewhere else for months. I have watched you listen to every monk we meet on this road, as though he might be holding the piece you are missing. I am still trying to understand what Yun Yan meant," Dongshan admitted. "He told me, before he died, only this person, just this person, and left it at that. Other monks describe their own understanding so plainly, so completely, and mine still will not resolve into anything I can hold or repeat to anyone." "Perhaps you are holding it the wrong way," Shen Shan said, "or holding it at all, when it was never a thing to be held in the first place, only something to be met." They came, not long after, to a shallow stream crossing the road, water moving clear and quick over pale stones, no more than knee-deep. Dongshan waded in first, and partway across, looking down to steady his footing, he saw his own face looking back up at him from the moving surface, broken and reassembled by the current with every step. Never quite still, never quite gone either. He stopped in the middle of the stream. Shen Shan, a few steps behind, asked what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Dongshan said slowly, still looking down. "I have been searching for him in every teacher I meet, every monk whose understanding sounds more finished than mine, but he was never out there to be found. He is right here, in the water, made of the same current I am standing in, and yet he is not quite me either. I cannot step toward him. I can only stop looking away from where I already am." "That sounds like very little to have walked so many miles to discover," Shen Shan said, though not unkindly, watching the current settle again around his companion's still legs. "It is not little," Dongshan said. "It is the difference between spending my whole life walking toward someone else's shore and finally noticing I have been standing in the river the entire time." He composed a few quiet lines to himself as they finished crossing, words he would carry the rest of his life, saying, in his own way, that he had stopped hunting for himself in other people's certainty, that wherever he walked now, he met himself plainly in the world around him, not as a fixed thing to be caught up to, but as something already present in every step, needing no other shore to prove it was real. Perhaps you have spent a long while, the way Dongshan did, searching for some settled version of yourself in the people around you, certain that once you resembled their apparent ease, their apparent arrival, you would finally know you had caught up. Perhaps you have never once considered that the thing you were straining toward across the water was never actually standing on the far bank at all, that it had been moving alongside you, in you. The entire time, you were looking elsewhere for it. What Dongshan let go of, in that shallow stream, was not the search itself, but the assumption that what he sought could be found anywhere other than exactly where he already stood, in whatever unfinished, uncertain shape he happened to be standing in that day. This is a strange kind of freedom, quieter than triumph, closer to simply setting down something you had forgotten you were carrying. The way a hand finally opens after holding something so long it had stopped noticing its own grip. Some centuries later, and a country away, a young widow named Mai would arrive at nearly the same understanding, without ever hearing Dongshan's name. on a riverbank crowded with floating lanterns. It was the 7th month, the season when families across the delta released small paper lanterns onto the river for those they had lost, watching them drift out into the dark as a way of sending love where words could no longer reach. Mai had done this every year since her husband's death, walking down to the same bend in the river each time with a lantern she had folded herself, and every year, without quite admitting it to herself, she had watched to see whose lantern traveled farthest before the flame finally went out, as though the distance a lantern managed to cross before dawn said something true about how well she had loved him, or how completely he had been released, or how much further along in her grief she had come compared to the women standing near her on the bank. This year her lantern caught early in a tangle of reeds near the bank, barely 20 lengths from where she had set it down, while further out other lanterns continued drifting toward the wide, dark middle of the river. "It has stopped," Mai said, to no one in particular, though an old woman fishing nearby, her small boat anchored close to the reeds. He heard her plainly enough. "So it has," the old woman said. "Does that trouble you? The others are still moving. Mine has already stopped, this close to the bank, as though it could not manage the distance the others are managing." "Distance from what?" the old woman asked, to where she reeled in her line slowly. "The lantern does not know it has stopped early. It only knows it is still burning, exactly where the current happened to leave it. You are the one deciding that further out means more loved, or more released, or more properly grieved. The river never made that decision. You did." "I did not mean to make it," Mai said. "I only noticed the others still moving, and mine already still." "Most of us do not mean to make these decisions," the old woman said. "We simply find ourselves, years later, already living inside the ones we made without noticing." Mai looked back at the small light caught among the reeds, still flickering, unmistakably a light. "I wanted it to travel as far as the others." "Why?" the old woman said, not unkindly, "when the love it carries is not measured in how far it drifts, only in the fact that you set it down at all, and that it is still burning while you watch it. A lantern stopped near the shore is not a lantern that failed. It is simply a lantern that stopped near the shore." Mai sat with this a while, watching her small light hold steady against the reeds, no longer straining to see how far the others had traveled by comparison. When it finally went dark sometime after midnight, it went dark the same way every other lantern on the river eventually would, near or far, having done exactly what it was set down to do. Dongshan stopped searching for himself in a stranger's certainty and found, instead, that he had been standing in the very water he was searching through the entire time. Mai stopped measuring her grief by the distance her lantern traveled and found that a small light caught near the shore had carried everything it needed to carry. The moment it was set down, neither of them had won a race. Both of them had simply noticed, each in their own way, that the race had never been the actual point, that it had been a shore drawn onto moving water by minds that needed something fixed to measure themselves against. This is the turning this particular ache eventually offers, if you let it run its full course instead of arguing with it forever. Not simply forgiving yourself for feeling behind, though that matters too, but seeing, clearly and all at once, that the very idea of behind and ahead was built on a shore that was never really there. A finish line drawn on water that closes over the moment you stop looking for it. Dongshan needed a stream and a reflection to see this. Mai needed a tangle of reeds and an old woman's plain question. You may only need tonight, and whatever small light you have been quietly comparing to someone else's, to see the same thing they saw, wherever your own small light has caught tonight, near the shore or further out, tangled in reeds or drifting freely. It is not failing simply because it has not traveled as far as some other light you happen to notice. It is doing exactly what it was set down to do, which was only ever to burn for as long as it was able, wherever the current happened to leave it. Let your whole body settle now, the way Mai's lantern finally settled, unmoving, unhurried, still quietly alight. There is no further shore you need to reach tonight, no distance still to be covered before you are permitted to rest. Let your shoulders lower, released from the last of the current you have been straining against. Let your legs grow heavy. The small muscles that have been quietly bracing towards some finish line finally allowed to soften completely into whatever is holding you. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in. You do not have to search the far side of the river for whatever it is you have been missing. It was never over there. It has been here, in this exact, unfinished shape, the entire time, in this body, on this particular night, needing no further shore to prove that it is real or that it is enough. Feel the weight of your own stillness now, not as failure, not as falling short of some further bank you were meant to reach, but simply as a small light that has found exactly where the current wished to leave it. Somewhere tonight, other lanterns are still drifting further out, and that is simply what belongs to them. Yours has found its own place, and its own place is enough. Rest now, exactly where the water has left you, held by nothing more urgent than your own next breath. Dongshan needed a stream and a lifetime of searching to discover that what he sought had never been separate from him. Mai needed a tangle of reeds and a single honest question. Some griefs, though, do not resolve so cleanly, because they are not griefs for anything the world agrees was ever real in the first place, and so they are rarely given a proper place to be set down at all, let alone a stranger willing to sit beside them while they burn. You may be carrying something like this yourself. Not only the loss of a person, or a chance, or a season of your life, but the quieter loss of the life you privately expected to be living by now. A life that never had a single day inside it, and so cannot be pointed to, or photographed, or spoken of at a gathering without sounding strange. Perhaps it is the marriage that did not happen, or the one that happened but never became what you pictured. Perhaps it is the career, the children, the particular shape of an ordinary Tuesday you assumed you would be living by this age. All of it built in careful, loving detail somewhere in your mind, and all of it gone now, though nothing you could point to on a calendar ever actually ended. You may have never been offered permission to mourn something that never technically existed. You may not have realized, until this moment, that it was allowed. There is a teaching that grief does not require an event to be legitimate, that the mind can form a full and detailed attachment to a future it imagined clearly enough, and that losing this imagined future can ache with an intensity fully equal to losing something that actually happened, though it rarely receives the same recognition, the same gathering of neighbors, the same permission to be named plainly. In a village near the great water tanks of ancient Sri Lanka, a woman once carried this exact grief for years without a name for it, until an old nun finally gave her one. The evening drum sounded once, low and distant, From the vihara across the fields, as dusk settled over the water tank that fed the village's rice terraces, its surface already turning the color of old brass. Nearer, the smell of jasmine and frangipani drifted from the small garden shrines along the path, mixing with wood smoke from the evening cooking fires and the faint murmur of families settling in for the night. And closest of all, Selah felt the rough clay of the small oil lamp warming slowly in her own hands as she carried it toward the vihara gate, the wick already trimmed, waiting to be lit. Would she ever be able to set down a grief she had never been permitted to properly name? Selah wondered, walking the familiar path in the fading light, or would she carry it quietly for the rest of her life, unspoken and unresolved, mistaken by everyone around her, including herself, for something that had long since finished. Her betrothed, a young man named Arya, had died of a fever in the dry season 11 years earlier, 3 months before their wedding was to take place. The village had grieved with her then, briefly and appropriately, the way villagers grieve a young man's death, bringing food and sitting with her family for the customary days. And after a suitable season had passed, most people had quietly moved on to expect that Selah, too, would eventually move on, marry elsewhere, resume the shape of an ordinary life. Her mother had gently raised the subject of other suitors more than once in those first years, and Selah had always found some practical reason to change the conversation, never quite able to explain what she herself did not yet have words for. And eventually, her mother had stopped asking, mistaking the silence for peace. She had not remarried, she told herself, and told the few who asked, that she had simply chosen to care for her aging parents instead, which was true, and which was also not the entire truth. What she had never told anyone, because she had no words for it and suspected it would sound foolish spoken aloud, was that she was not only grieving Arya, she was grieving an entire imagined life that had died alongside him, a house they had spoken of building near the eastern tank, the particular number of children they had joked about having, the exact sound she had imagined their household would make in the evenings, the arguments they would have had over small things, and the way they would have made peace afterward, none of which had ever existed anywhere except inside her own mind, and all of which she still, 11 years later, occasionally found herself missing as though it had been real and lost, rather than simply never begun. At the Vihara gate that evening, she found the old Theri, Uttara, already seated near the lamp shelf, watching the last light fail over the water. Selah knelt to light her own lamp from the flame already burning there, and something in her hands must have shown more than she intended, because the old nun spoke before Selah had said a word. "You have been lighting a lamp for that young man for 11 years now," Theri Uttara said. "I wonder sometimes who you are actually lighting it for." Selah's hand stilled over the wick. "For Arya. Who else would it be for?" "That is what I am asking you," the old nun said, not unkindly, "because it has occurred to me, watching you these many evenings, that you may be grieving 2 different things, and giving them only one lamp between them." "I don't understand," Selah said, though something in her chest had already gone very still. "The man is one loss," Theri Uttara said. "The house you never built together is another. The children you never had is another still. None of those lives ever existed for even a single day, and so no one has ever told you it was permitted to grieve them. And I suspect you have never quite believed it was permitted either. You have been trying to bury a man twice, once in the earth, and once in a future that died alongside him, but was never given its own grave. Seela felt something break loose in her chest that she had held so long she had stopped recognizing it as held. How does one grieve a life that was never actually lived? The same way you grieve anything else, the old nun said. You name it plainly. You give it its own light, and you let it finish burning down completely, instead of asking one small flame to carry two different griefs forever. But it feels strange, Seela said, to mourn something that has no grave, no body, nothing anyone else ever saw or could confirm was ever truly there. Most of what people carry the longest has no grave, Uttara said. That is often exactly why it is carried so long, and so far, and so quietly. No one ever tells us where such things are meant to be set down, so we simply keep walking with them, year after year, mistaking the weight for something we are required to carry forever. Seela sat with the unlit lamp still warm in her hands for a long while, the evening drum silent now, the water tank turning the color of the darkening sky, small ripples catching the last traces of light near the shore. Then, quietly, she lit a second lamp beside the first and set it a small distance apart on the stone shelf. This one is for the house we never built, she said, mostly to herself. Her voice barely above the sound of the wind moving through the palms above the gate. And the children we never had. And every ordinary evening we never got to spend arguing over nothing at all, and making peace again before sleep. She let both lamps burn all the way down that night, sitting beside them until the second flame guttered and went dark on its own. Unhurried, complete, long after the first had already finished. It was not that her grief for Arya lessened. It was that, for the first time in 11 years, it stopped being asked to carry an entire unlived life on top of itself. And she found, walking home afterward in the dark, that her steps felt lighter than they had in longer than she could easily remember. Perhaps you have been lighting one lamp for two different losses yourself, without ever separating them, without ever being told it was permitted to name the second one at all. The relationship that ended, and the whole imagined future that ended with it. The career you did not have and the entire self you expected to become inside it. The family you pictured clearly enough to miss, even though it never had a single ordinary Tuesday inside it to actually be missed. The version of your own life that quietly stopped being possible at some specific moment you can probably still name, if you let yourself look for it. What Seela had been holding, without a name for it, was the belief that only real, documented losses deserved a proper mourning, that an imagined life, however vivid, however carefully built in the quiet architecture of hope, did not count as something a person was permitted to grieve. This belief keeps countless private griefs unspoken for years, carried silently, because no calendar marks their anniversary, and no one else remembers there was ever anything there to lose. It is a very particular kind of loneliness, mourning something that no one else can see, and it often gets mistaken for simply being unable to move on, when in truth, it is a grief that has never once been given its own proper ceremony. There is an old teaching that suffering multiplies whenever it is denied its rightful name, that a grief refused its own recognition does not disappear. It simply stays lodged exactly where it was first set down, unresolved, waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime, to be finally called by what it actually is. Naming it does not make the loss smaller. It only makes it possible, at last, to finish grieving it properly, instead of carrying it forever as an unfinished, unnamed weight tucked inside, a grief that was supposed to have ended long ago. Tonight, if you are carrying a life you once expected and never lived, you are permitted to name it separately from whatever loss it grew alongside. You do not need anyone else to confirm that it was real enough to grieve. It lived, fully and in detail, inside you, for as long as you carried it, and it is allowed its own quiet light, its own permission to finally burn all the way down. Let your hands soften now around whatever unlit lamp you have been carrying for a future that never arrived. Let your shoulders lower, released from the old belief that this particular grief did not count enough to be set down properly, that it needed a grave or a date or a witness before it could be considered real. Let your chest loosen, the way sailors did, once the second flame finally had its own place to burn instead of being folded invisibly into the first. Carried silently under the weight of a loss that already had a name. Let your jaw unclench too, from whatever quiet argument it has been making, for years perhaps, that this loss was too strange or too private to be named aloud. You do not have to keep carrying an unlived life on top of your actual one any longer. If there is a version of your own days that quietly stopped being possible somewhere along the way, you are allowed, tonight, simply in the privacy of this dark room, to give it its own name, its own light, its own permission to finally finish burning down completely. No one else needs to witness it for it to be real. No one else needs to agree it mattered for it to have mattered. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and let both griefs, the one that happened and the one that never got the chance to, finally be given their separate, honest light, each allowed to finish in its own time. Feel your whole body settling now, heavier and looser with each breath, the way a lamp settles once its flame has finally, completely gone out. Rest now, with nothing left to carry that was never truly yours to hold in the first place. Sela learned to grieve a life she had never lived. There is a further practice available past even that, one that has less to do with grief and more to do with an ordinary kind of courage. The courage required simply to keep walking your own pace once you have stopped comparing it to anyone else's, especially when the people around you keep asking you to explain yourself. You have perhaps softened the sting of feeling behind. You have perhaps begun to see that the race was never quite real. What remains, for many people, is the daily, unglamorous work of actually living at your own pace once you have understood all of this, particularly when family gatherings, old friends, and well-meaning relatives keep asking, gently or otherwise, why your life does not look the way theirs expected it to by now, why you have not married, why you left the career everyone assumed you would keep, why you are only now doing the thing you could have done a decade earlier, as though a decade were a debt owed to someone else's calendar rather than simply the time it actually took you. There is a teaching that peace does not require anyone else's agreement, that a path can be entirely legitimate without a single other person ever approving of it, and that waiting for such approval before you allow yourself to walk forward is its own quiet form of never actually starting, a kind of permanent pause disguised as patience. A woman in 11th century Tibet lived this teaching so completely that entire delegations were eventually sent simply to determine whether she could possibly be telling the truth about her own life. Her name was Mahig Labdron, and by the time she was a grown woman, she had already left the nunnery where she had trained, married a practitioner named Thopa Bhadra, and begun raising children while continuing to teach a form of practice she had developed herself. One that had no clear lineage running back through any of the traditional channels her critics expected. No distant Indian master whose name could be invoked to settle every doubt in a single sentence. Word of her spread across the mountains, carried by traders and pilgrims from one valley to the next. And so, eventually, did doubt, until the doubt traveled further than her own teaching ever had, all the way to India itself, where the tradition she was said to be reinventing had originally taken root. Would she ever be permitted to walk her own path without first satisfying everyone who doubted it? Machig sometimes wondered in those years. Or would she spend her whole life defending a life she had never once asked anyone's permission to live? One evening, not long before a delegation of Indian panditas was expected to arrive and formally examine her teaching, one of her own students found her at her usual evening work and could not hide his worry. "They mean to expose you," he said. "Some say you invented your entire practice out of nothing, that it traces to no true lineage at all, and that when the panditas arrive, they will prove it in front of everyone who has ever come to you." "Then let them come and look," Machig said, not pausing in what she was doing. "I have never once taught in order to be believed." "But if they find you unconvincing," the student pressed, "everything you have built could be undone in a single afternoon. Should we not prepare something to show them? Some proof, some argument ready before they arrive? I did not begin this path to be validated by strangers arriving from another country," Machig said, "and I do not intend to end it that way either. Whatever truth exists in what I teach will show itself when it is tested, or it will not. And either way, I will still rise tomorrow morning and do exactly what I did this morning." "You are not even a little afraid," the student said, and it was somewhere between a question and an accusation. "I am not without fear," Machig said. "I simply decided some years ago that fear was a poor reason to stop walking, and a worse reason to start explaining myself to people who had not yet even arrived to ask. Perhaps you have felt something like the student's fear yourself, the anxious certainty that your own unconventional pace needs a strong defense, prepared and ready before anyone questions it, that you must have your explanation polished and waiting at every family gathering, every reunion, every casual question about why your life does not resemble what was expected of it. Perhaps you have rehearsed your answer in the shower or in the car on the way to the gathering, certain that this year, finally, the right explanation would put the matter to rest for good. What Machig had already understood, long before any delegation arrived, was that living authentically and being universally believed were two entirely separate matters, and that confusing them, waiting for the second before permitting yourself the first, was a trap with no actual exit, since there will always be one more skeptic left to convince, one more relative left unpersuaded, one more version of the same question waiting just past the one you finally managed to answer well. When the panditas finally arrived and put their questions to her, Machig answered plainly, without performing for their approval and without shrinking from their doubt either. It is said that what she offered them that day satisfied even the most rigorous among them, and that her teaching was recognized from that point forward as legitimate across a much wider circle than before, carried back to India by the very scholars who had come to disprove it. But it is worth noticing that Machig herself did not appear to change at all, before the testing or after it. She had already been walking her own pace for years by the time anyone thought to question it. and she continued walking it exactly the same way once the questioning was finished, teaching the same students, keeping the same evening rhythm, needing no fresh applause to keep her own path feeling real to her. Some centuries later, and a country away, a man named Thura would face a smaller version of the very same test. Without ever hearing Machig's name, Thura had spent most of his life as a trader in the river towns of Burma, marrying late, raising no children, and taking his ordination as a monk only in his 40th year. Decades after most of the young novices he now sat beside in the monastery hall, some of whom had entered as boys and knew no other life at all. His family had not understood it. They had watched him build a modest trading business over 20 years, had assumed he would eventually pass it to a nephew and settle into a comfortable old age near the river, and had not expected him to give it all away in a single season, to sit shoulder to shoulder with boys young enough to be his grandsons. At the yearly gathering that brought his relatives together, someone always found a way to ask why it had taken him so long, whether he regretted the years spent trading instead of training, whether he wished he had come to this decision earlier, the way his younger brother had, who had ordained at 19 and now held a respected position at a large monastery in the capital. For years, Thura had answered these questions at length, explaining the slow unfolding of his own understanding, defending the particular shape of his own life, as though a sufficiently thorough answer might finally satisfy every relative gathered around the table. It never did. There was always another question waiting behind the last one. At one such gathering, an old traveling nun who had stopped at the monastery for the night happened to be seated near him when his aunt asked, once again, why he had waited so long. Thura began his usual explanation, and the old nun, without unkindness, simply said, "You do not owe this table your entire reasoning. You only owe it the truth. Once, plainly stated." "But they keep asking," Thura said, lowering his voice so his aunt would not hear. "Every year, the same question, dressed slightly differently. They will keep asking regardless of how well you answer," she said. "That has very little to do with you and a great deal to do with them, with whatever timeline they are quietly measuring their own lives against when they look at yours. You are permitted to say your truth once and let their questions be their own concern from then on. And if they are disappointed in the answer, then they will be disappointed," the old nun said, "the same way weather disappoints a farmer some seasons. You do not owe the weather an explanation either, and yet you have never once thought to argue with the rain." That year, when the question came again, Thura simply said, "I came to this when I was ready, and not before," and did not elaborate further, even as his aunt clearly wanted him to. The conversation moved on to other things. The following year, the question came less often. By the third year, no one asked at all, not because they had all finally agreed with his timing, but because he had stopped offering them a debate to have. Machig never persuaded every skeptic who ever doubted her. Thura never fully satisfied every relative who thought he had taken too long. Neither of them found peace by winning the argument. They found it by understanding that the argument itself was optional, that a life can be lived at its own honest pace, whether or not the people watching ever fully approve of the timing, and that the winning of an argument was never actually the thing either of them needed in order to keep walking. This does not mean explanation is always wrong, or that loved ones' questions deserve no answer at all. Machig answered the panditas honestly when they arrived. Thura still answered his aunt. Once, plainly, every year the question returned. It means only that your own pace does not require a permanent, ongoing defense in order to be valid, that you are permitted to state your truth plainly, once, and then return to living it. Regardless of how many more times the question gets asked around you, regardless of whether the questioner ever fully accepts the answer you have given, there is a quiet difference between answering a question and defending your entire existence in response to it. And most of the exhaustion in these moments comes from confusing the two. Machig answered a formal examination and went back to her ordinary evening. Thura answered his aunt and returned to his meal. Neither of them stayed at the table arguing long after the plain truth had already been spoken. Wherever you have been, keeping a defense polished and ready for a decision, a timeline, a shape of life that does not resemble what was expected of you. You are permitted tonight to set the defense down. You do not have to win anyone over before you are allowed to keep walking at your own pace. You were already allowed. You have been allowed the entire time. Let your shoulders lower now, released from the old readiness to explain yourself the moment anyone raises an eyebrow. Let your jaw soften, no longer rehearsing an argument for a table that may ask the same question again next year, regardless of how well you answer it tonight. Let your hands rest, empty of whatever proof you have been quietly carrying, waiting to present it the next time someone doubts you. Let your feet grow heavy too, no longer bracing to defend the exact ground you are standing on. You do not owe tonight, or any night, a full accounting of your own timing. You do not have to prepare a stronger argument before you are allowed to sleep, or rehearse a better answer for the next relative who raises the question, or win over every remaining skeptic before your own pace is finally permitted to feel legitimate. It has been legitimate the entire time, whether or not it was ever fully understood by everyone watching it. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and let your whole body settle into the simple, sufficient fact of your own pace, needing no delegation's approval, no relative's agreement, no verdict from anyone at all, in order to be exactly as real and as valid as it has always been. Somewhere, a table is still asking its familiar questions, the same ones it has asked for years, and you do not have to answer them again tonight, or ever again with more than the plain truth, once spoken. Rest now, at your own speed, answerable to no one but the quiet certainty of your own next breath. Machig never needed a delegation's verdict to know her own path was real. Thura never needed his aunt's full agreement to keep walking his. Tonight asks something a little larger of you than even that. Not simply releasing the need for others to approve of your pace, but releasing the very idea that pace, ahead and behind, early and late, was ever a meaningful way to measure a single day of your life at all. This is not the same as saying nothing matters, or that effort and care make no difference. It is closer to something wider than that, a kind of spaciousness that opens once the whole architecture of behind and ahead, on time and late, simply stops being the frame you are looking through. Most people never question the frame itself. They only ever argue about where exactly they fall inside it, spending entire seasons of their lives convinced the frame was the only honest way to see anything at all. You may have kept your own private measurements without ever calling them that. The birthday that arrived and made you quietly recalculate everything you had assumed you would have accomplished by now. The new year that felt less like a celebration than an audit. The habit, so automatic you barely notice it anymore, of checking your current chapter against some imagined average, some invisible schedule everyone else appears to be following more gracefully than you. There is a teaching that a single day, examined closely enough, contains everything it needs within itself and requires no comparison to yesterday or tomorrow in order to be complete, though almost no one arrives at this understanding without first spending a great deal of time trying to measure one day against another. The Chan master in 10th century China offered this teaching to his assembly one autumn morning, though it took one particular monk considerably longer than the rest of the hall to actually receive it. The temple gong sounded 3 times across the courtyard, calling the monks to the morning assembly. Nearer, the shuffle and murmur of robes settled into rows as the hall filled, breath visible in the cool autumn air, the smell of the previous evening's incense still faintly clinging to the wooden beams overhead. And closest of all, inside his own sleeve, the monk Huai Zhen felt the small knotted cord he carried everywhere. His thumb finding the newest knot the way it always did each morning, counting. He had begun the cord on his very first day at the temple, tying a small knot each evening as a private discipline, a way of tracking whether he was truly practicing or simply passing time in robes. It had seemed, at the beginning, like a reasonable enough method. Somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd month, without quite noticing the shift, checking the cord each morning had become less a record of his practice and more an anxious substitute for it. A way of reassuring himself he was still moving, even on mornings when he could not have said, if pressed, what exactly he had moved toward. Would he ever stop counting the days until he finally felt as far along as he believed he was supposed to be? Wai Sen wondered, settling into his place in the hall. Or would every morning simply become one more knot, added to a cord that never seemed to bring him any closer to wherever it was he thought he was going? A destination he had never actually been able to name, even to himself. Yunmen stood before the assembly and let the silence settle before he spoke. I am not asking you about the days before the 15th, he said. Tell me instead about the days after the 15th. No one answered. The hall remained still, monks glancing sideways at one another, waiting for someone braver or wiser to offer something. The autumn light, through the high windows, shifting slowly across the stone floor as the silence stretched longer than anyone had expected it to. Wisen, seated near the back, found his own mind racing through an entirely private arithmetic, trying to work out which day of his own count the question might correspond to. Whether he was somewhere before an equivalent 15th or somewhere after it. Whether this particular morning counted toward his progress or simply passed through him unmarked, the way so many of his 200 mornings already had. When no one spoke, Yunmen answered for the whole assembly. Every day is a good day, he said, and moved on to the next matter without further explanation. Leaving the hall to sit with it, however, each monk was able. After the assembly ended, Huaizhen found himself lingering near the courtyard, and Yunmen, passing through on his way to his own quarters, stopped when he noticed the young monk's stillness was not the stillness of settled understanding. You have a question, Yunmen said, pausing beside him. It was not phrased as a question itself. I keep a cord, Huaizhen admitted, drawing the knotted length from his sleeve, his fingers a little unsteady. I have counted every day since I arrived at this temple. Today marks the 200th. I had hoped, by now, to feel considerably further along than I do. Further along than what Yunmen asked, his voice unhurried, as though he had all morning to wait for the answer. "Then where I was on the first day," Huaizhen said. "I keep the cord so I can be certain I am actually progressing, and not simply repeating the same day over and over without moving anywhere at all. The way water can look like it is moving, while actually going nowhere in a stagnant pool." Yunmen studied him for a moment. "Show me the 150th knot." Huaizhen's fingers moved along the cord, counting carefully, until he found what he believed was the correct knot and held it between finger and thumb. "This one, Master." "What happened on that day?" Huaizhen opened his mouth and found, to his own surprise, that nothing came. He could not distinguish the 150th day from the 149th, or the 151st, or a dozen other mornings that had folded indistinguishably into one another somewhere in the middle of his counting. "You cannot even find the 150th day inside yourself," Yunmen said, not unkindly. "And yet you are entirely certain that the 200th means something the 150th did not. You have been so occupied counting the days that you have forgotten to actually live inside any single one of them." "Then the counting was pointless," Huaizhen said, something in his chest sinking. "Not pointless," Yunmen said. "Only smaller than you believed it to be. A cord can remind you to sit down and practice. It cannot tell you whether you were actually present once you did. Those are two very different kinds of counting, and you have been mistaking one for the other for 200 mornings now. Certain the string was measuring something, the string was never built to measure. The counting was never what carried you here," Yunmen continued. "Each morning carried you here, complete in itself, requiring no other morning before or after it to prove its own worth. Burn the cord if it helps you remember this, not because counting itself is wrong, but because you have been asking a length of string to tell you something only this exact day was ever able to answer." Huaizhen looked down at the cord in his hand. 200 small knots representing 200 mornings he could no longer clearly recall, each one reduced to a single, indistinguishable mark on a string. None of them actually lived as fully as they might have been, because some part of him had always been half occupied with counting toward a day that had not yet arrived. That evening, he untied the cord entirely, not in anger, and not with any particular ceremony, simply setting the small knotted length aside, the way a person sets aside a tool that has finished its usefulness and has nothing further to teach. The next morning, for the first time in 200 days, he woke without immediately reaching to mark another knot, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that the morning arrived exactly the same as every other morning had. Whole and unhurried, needing no tally to confirm it had happened. Perhaps you have kept your own version of Huaizhen's cord, whether marked in knots, in calendar entries, in a private tally of milestones you believe should have been reached by now. Perhaps you could not, if asked directly tonight, actually describe what happened on day 150 of anything you have been counting. Only that the counting itself had begun to feel like proof you were still moving forward, even on the days you could barely remember living through at all. What Huaizhen had been holding was the belief that a single day only had value in relation to the days around it, that today mattered chiefly as evidence of progress since yesterday, or as a step towards some better tomorrow, rather than as something whole and sufficient simply by having been lived at all. This belief turns even ordinary mornings into unpaid debts, each one owed to some future day that will supposedly redeem all the counting that came before it. A debt that never actually gets paid off, because the redeeming day, once it arrive, simply becomes one more day owed to the day after it. There is an old teaching, still spoken in monasteries centuries after Yunmen first offered it, that every day, examined honestly and without comparison, is already a good day, not because every day feels pleasant, but because every day is complete precisely as it is, requiring nothing further from tomorrow in order to have been worth living. Rain is a good day. Difficulty is a good day. An ordinary Tuesday, with nothing remarkable in it at all, is, in this sense, exactly as good as any other, because goodness here has stopped being a comparison and become simply a description of what is actually fully present, whether or not it resembles what you had hoped for when you woke up that morning. If you were to imagine, tonight, every small light that has ever been set down on moving water, in every country, across every century, each one burning for exactly as long as it was able, and then quietly going dark, you would find there was never a first lantern and never a last one. Only one continuous, unbroken, drifting, each light complete in the exact moment it was burning, needing no other light before or after it to justify its place on the water. Ren's small ferry crossing its short stretch of river, Mai's lantern caught in the reeds, Sella's second flame finally given its own place to burn, Waijian's 200 forgotten mornings. All of it belongs to that same unbroken drift, none of it requiring the others to have happened in any particular order for it to have mattered. Your own life belongs to it too. It does not require 150th day to justify a 200th one. It only requires this one, entered fully, exactly as it is. Let your hands soften now, releasing whatever cord you have been quietly counting on, whatever private tally you have kept of how far along you believe you should be. Let your shoulders lower, no longer weighing tonight against every night that came before it, or every night still to come. Let your whole mind widen, the way a small room widens the moment someone opens every window in it at once. The walls still there, but no longer felt the same way. Let your jaw soften too, released from the quiet effort of composing tomorrow's progress report before tonight has even finished. You do not need to know which numbered day this is in order to rest in it completely. You do not need to check the knot before you are permitted to sleep, or confirm that today measured up to some invisible average before you allow your body to finally let go. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and let this exact, uncounted, unhurried night be enough, entirely on its own, needing no other night to prove that it happened, or that it mattered, or that you were here for it. Feel your whole body settling now, heavier and looser with each breath, held by nothing more demanding than the simple fact of this particular night, whole in itself, asking nothing further of you. Somewhere, a chord lies untouched, its counting finally finished. Rest now, inside the one day you actually have, which was always, quietly, enough. Waijian untied his cord and found the next morning arrived unchanged, whole, needing no tally. What comes after that kind of release is often smaller than people expect. Not a grand transformation, no dramatic unburdening witnessed by anyone else, only a quiet, ordinary morning that simply stops asking you to check on anyone else's before it lets you begin your own. There is little left to explain about this part of the night. It is less an idea now than a feeling. The particular lightness of a shoulder that has finally stopped turning to see how far ahead someone else has gotten. The small unclenching in the chest that arrives once a habit you barely noticed you were carrying simply stops asking to be fed. Day after day, evening after evening, for reasons that were never entirely clear even to the person doing the feeding. You may already feel a version of this settling into you. Here, this many hours into the night, the concepts growing quieter, the body growing heavier, the need for explanation growing smaller with each passing minute. That is exactly as it should be. Two small lives, lived in ocean apart from each other, show what this lightning actually looks like more plainly than any further teaching could tonight. On the wide, slow waters of a great lake in old Cambodia, a fisherman named Vishet used to rise before dawn and count the boats already out ahead of him, the way he had for years. Before he stopped, he had built the habit slowly, without ever deciding to. In his first years on the water, counting the other boats had simply been practical, a way of knowing where the fish were likely running that morning, which families had already claimed which stretch of shallows. Useful information any careful fisherman might reasonably want. Somewhere along the way, without his quite noticing the shift, the counting had stopped being about the fish at all. It had become a way of measuring his own morning against everyone else's, a private scorecard he checked before his net had even touched the water, long before he had any real evidence of how his own day would actually go, as though the other boat's positions could somehow predict his own. Mist lay low over the water at that hour, the far shore invisible behind it. The shapes of distant boats reduced to soft grey smudges against the pale sky. Nearer, the soft knock of hulls against the mooring posts marked where the other fishermen were already loading their nets, voices carrying faintly across the still water. And closest of all, Vishet felt the familiar roughness of his own net beneath his hands, still faintly damp from the evening before, coiled and waiting exactly where he had left it. Would this be another morning spent watching other boats disappear into the mist ahead of him? Vishet wondered. Or would he finally simply push off and fish his own stretch of water without checking who had gotten there first, without carrying the quiet, familiar weight of that particular question through the whole morning ahead of him? His son, Sofik, paddling beside him that morning, noticed something different in the way his father worked. Unhurried, not glancing toward the other boats scattered across the grey water the way he usually did before the sun had even fully cleared the tree line. "You are not counting them today," Sofik said, noticing the change plainly now. "No," Vishet said, settling his net into the water with an easy, practiced motion, the rope sliding smoothly through his weathered, sun-worn hands. "You used to always know how many boats were out before us. You could tell me before we had even reached the water." "I did," Vishet said. "For a long time I thought it told me something true about my own quiet morning. It never did. It only ever told me where everyone else happened to be standing, which is a different thing entirely from where I happened to be standing myself." And now Sofik asked, watching his father's steady hands. "Now I know where my own net is," Vishet said, which was always the only part of the morning that actually belonged to me. "The other boats will fish wherever the fish happen to be running for them. Mine will fish wherever the fish happen to be running for me. Counting never once changed where either of those things occurred. Sophie was quiet for a while, watching the mist begin to lift off the water as the sun climbed higher, the grey shapes of the other boats slowly resolving into colour and detail as the light strengthened around them. "It seems lighter," he finally said, not knowing. "It is lighter," Vichette said. "I did not expect that. I thought giving up the counting would feel like losing something, some small edge I had always relied on. It only ever felt like setting something down that I had been carrying for so long I had mistaken the weight of it for part of my own hands." The sun rose fully over the lake as they worked, the last of the mist burning away into an ordinary bright morning, indistinguishable, in the end, from any other morning on the water, which was, Vichette had come to think, precisely the point. Far to the west, in a hill village in Old Laos, an old woman named Bua sat in her garden most evenings now, no longer listening quite so closely for news of her neighbour's grandchildren. For years she had kept a careful private accounting, whose son had married well, whose daughter had gone to study in the city, whose family seemed to be flourishing, while her own simply continued along at its own unremarkable pace, planting the same crops in the same season, sending no children off to distant cities, producing no news that seemed worth repeating at the well where the village women gathered each morning. She had told herself this accounting was simply neighbourly interest, the ordinary curiosity of a small village where everyone's business drifted eventually to everyone else's ears, carried along with the morning water and the evening cooking smoke, whether anyone asked for it or not. It had taken her a long time to notice how much of it she carried home afterward, turning it over in the quiet of her own evenings, measuring her own family's ordinary contentment against everyone else's more visible fortune, as though contentment itself needed to be weighed against something else in order to count for anything at all. Her granddaughter, visiting one evening as the light went gold and then soft grey over the surrounding hills, found her simply sitting among the beans, not asking after anyone, her hands moving slowly through the soil around the young plants. "You did not ask about the neighbour's new grandson," her granddaughter said, settling into the dirt beside her grandmother. "No," Bua said, working a bit of soil loose with her fingers, checking the small green shoots with an unhurried, practiced eye. "I stopped keeping that particular ledger a while ago." "Why?" her granddaughter asked, tilting her head slightly. "Because it never once made my own garden grow any faster," Bua said, "and it cost me a great deal of my evenings, sitting here worrying instead of simply watching things grow at whatever pace they were actually growing." "But don't you want to know how everyone is doing?" her granddaughter asked, genuinely curious, not accusing. "I want to know how my own beans are doing," Bua said, "and how my own hands feel in this soil at the end of the day, tired in the good way, not the worried way. The rest of it used to arrive whether I asked for it or not, and I found I was carrying all of it home with me anyway, uninvited, setting a place for it at my own table every evening." Her granddaughter sat with this a moment. "Doesn't it feel strange, not knowing everyone else's news anymore?" "It felt strange for about a season," Bua admitted. "Now it mostly just feels quiet. I did not know how much of my evening had been spent elsewhere, in other people's houses, in other people's good fortune, until I finally brought all of it back here, into my own garden, where it had wanted to be the whole time, waiting patiently for me to notice." Vichette no longer counts the boats ahead of him. Bua no longer keeps her ledger of other families' fortunes. Neither of them arrived at anything dramatic. They simply noticed one ordinary morning and one ordinary evening that the checking had stopped, and that what replaced it was not emptiness, but a kind of room they had not realized their own lives were missing. A quiet space where a fisherman's net or a grandmother's garden soil could simply be felt for exactly what it was, without a second, invisible ledger running alongside it the whole time. Both of them had spent years believing the checking was simply part of paying attention, part of caring properly about their own place in the world. Neither of them had quite noticed how much of their actual attention it had been quietly borrowing, morning after morning, evening after evening, until the borrowing simply stopped, and they found there was more of themselves left over than they had realized was missing. More patience for the actual net in their hands, more attention for the actual soil beneath their fingers, more room, simply, for the life that had been waiting quietly underneath the counting the entire time. You may notice this same quiet lightening in yourself tonight, if you let it come without forcing it or reaching for it too eagerly. The absence of a habit you have not even fully named yet. The checking, the comparing, the private tally you have carried so long, it started to feel like simply paying attention rather than a weight at all. It is not gone because you argued it away, the way you might win a debate, wearing yourself down until the old habit finally conceded the point. It is gone the way morning mist lifts off water, without announcement, without ceremony, simply because the sun has finally had enough time to reach it, patiently, without hurrying the mist along at all, without asking it to justify how slowly it had been lifting until now. Let your shoulders settle now, the way Vichette's did. No longer turn toward the other boats, scattered somewhere out in the mist. No longer needing to know their number before you can begin your own quiet work. Let your hands rest, the way Boaz rests in her own garden soil, tending only what is actually yours to tend, releasing whatever does not belong in your own two palms tonight. Let your jaw soften too, and your forehead, and the small muscles around your eyes that have spent so many nights quietly scanning for something to measure yourself against. Feel the weight of your own body now, heavier with every breath, settling into whatever is holding you, the way a boat settles once it has finally been tied for the night, the way soil settles once a hand has finished working it and simply rests. There is a lake somewhere, wide and grey and endless, its surface unbroken, except for the soft ripple of a single net being drawn slowly through it. Unhurried, unwatched by anyone. There is a garden somewhere, small and green and quiet, its rows tended by hands that have stopped hurrying toward anyone else's harvest, content simply to feel the soil give way beneath careful fingers. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in, and let this ordinary night be enough, entirely unwatched, entirely your own, requiring no other night's report to justify how it was spent. You do not need to know how anyone else's evening is going in order to finish your own. You do not need to check. Somewhere on a wide grey lake, a boat moves through thinning mist, its net already in the water, its course simple and unhurried. Somewhere in a small garden, a woman sits among her beans, listening to nothing but the evening settling around her, her hands quiet in the cooling soil. Let your own evening settle the same way, mist lifting slowly off whatever you have been carrying, the ground beneath you asking nothing more of you than to simply rest upon it. And somewhere further still, in the deepening quiet of the night ahead, Other small lights are already beginning to settle too, one by one, the way they always eventually do, needing nothing more from you now than to keep drifting gently alongside them. Rest now. There is nothing left to count tonight. Vishay stopped counting the boats. Bua stopped keeping her ledger. There is one more layer beneath even that kind of quiet, one that does not always arrive gently. Sometimes the people who moved ahead of us are not strangers on distant boats. Sometimes they are people we loved, people we taught, people whose leaving behind still carries a small, private sting we have never quite said aloud. You may carry a version of this yourself. Some particular person whose success sits a little differently than the rest of the world's successes do, because they once stood closer to you than the others did. A friend you helped through difficult years, now thriving somewhere you were not invited to see. A student you shaped patiently, now celebrated for work that carries your fingerprints all through it, unacknowledged. A younger sibling who found the ease you never quite managed to find yourself, and who somehow stopped needing you exactly when you might have hoped, quietly, that they would need you most. Someone who moved forward while you stayed, and who you have not entirely forgiven for it, even if you have never once said so, even to yourself, even in the privacy of your own late-night thoughts. In a mountain village in old Bhutan, a woodcarver named Karma had carried something like this for a long time, quietly, the way a stone is carried in a pocket long after anyone remembers picking it up. Its weight so familiar, it stops registering as weight at all, until someone else notices the way it pulls at the seam. There is a teaching that resentment held long enough stops being about the person who caused it and becomes, instead, a private argument with an empty chair, one that can never actually be won because the other party stopped attending it years ago, if they ever even knew it was taking place at all. Pine smoke drifted from the village rooftops in the cold evening air, thinning as it rose past the prayer flags strung between the houses. Nearer, wood shavings curled from beneath Karma's blade, pale against the dark bench where he worked, catching the last of the lamplight. And closest of all, his hands, weathered and sure, moved through a pattern they had carved 10,000 times before, needing no thought at all to find their way. Would he ever stop feeling this particular ache? Karma wondered, whenever word reached the village of his old apprentice's latest work. Or would it simply live in him now, quiet and permanent, the way an old injury lives in a knee that otherwise works perfectly well, flaring only on the coldest evenings, when least expected? Tashi had trained under him for 6 years, a boy with quick hands and quicker eyes, arriving at his workshop as a thin, restless 12-year-old, sent by parents who did not know what else to do with a son, who could not sit still in the village school but could sit for hours over a single piece of wood. Karma had taught him everything, patiently, the way his own teacher had once taught him, correcting his grip, his angles, his patience. Watching him grow from a boy who ruined more wood than he saved into a young man whose carved doors people began traveling from other villages simply to see. Then Tashi had left for the capital, to carve for temples and great houses, far grander than anything their small village could offer. And he had become well known there, quickly, the way talent sometimes does when it finally finds a large enough room to be seen in, a room their small mountain village could never have provided him. Word of his work reached even this quiet valley, carried by travelers, by monks, by anyone passing through who had seen the doors he carved for a jong in the east. Doors people spoke of the way they spoke of good weather, as though such skill simply arrived in a person fully formed. Karma had taught him everything, patiently, year after year. Karma had also, somewhere in the years since, stopped receiving letters, the way a stream stops reaching a field once its course has quietly shifted elsewhere. One evening, in late autumn, a figure appeared at Karma's gate, dust from the mountain road still on his robes. Karma did not recognize him at first, until he spoke. "I did not know if you would still be working this late," Tashi said, standing awkwardly near the threshold, as though uncertain whether he still had any right to cross it. Karma set down his blade slowly, carefully. "I am always still working this late," he said, and there was an edge in it he did not quite manage to soften. "Some of us never left the bench long enough to have anywhere else to be in the evenings." Tashi absorbed this without flinching. "I have thought of coming back for a long time," he said. "I kept telling myself the road was too far. The season was wrong. There would be time later. I am sorry it took me this long to find out that was not true." "You could have written," Karma said, and heard, even as he said it, how many years of accumulated silence had gone into those 3 small words. "I truly could have," Tashi agreed, quietly. "I told myself, every single year, that the letter I owed you had grown too large to fit on a page, that I would need to come in person to say it properly, and so I kept postponing the visit instead of simply writing the smaller, truer thing." Karma said nothing for a moment, turning a half-finished piece over in his hands, feeling the old, familiar tightness gather in his chest, the one that had been gathering there for years, thickening with every season. Tashi's name arrived in the village, attached to some new, distant success. "I still carve the way you taught me," Tashi said quietly, into the long silence between them. "Every door I have ever made, I have made with your hands, not mine. People in the capital praise my eye, my patience, my precision, and none of them know that every one of those things came from 6 years spent exactly where you are sitting right now. I have simply never said so, to you or to anyone, and I think that has been a kind of theft." Something in Karma's chest, held so long he had stopped noticing the holding, loosened without his quite deciding to let it go. He looked at the young man standing in his doorway, dusty and uncertain, road-worn in a way that no one in the capital likely ever saw. Not the celebrated craftsman of distant stories, but simply the boy who had once stood at this same bench, learning to hold a blade properly, flinching each time he cut against the grain until his hands finally learned better. He did not say that it was fine, or that it had never mattered. Both of those would have been untrue, and some part of him understood that saying them would have been its own small dishonesty, a way of ending the discomfort quickly rather than actually meeting it. He only held out his hand for Tashi's, the way he once had when teaching him to steady a cut, guiding the younger hand with his own until the motion settled into something steady and sure. Tashi took it, and for a moment, neither of them said anything further. The workshop quiet, except for the small settling sounds of the fire in the corner and the wind moving against the shuttered window. "I am still angry," Karma said eventually, plainly, without apology, setting the half-finished piece down beside him. "I do not think that will disappear simply because you have come back tonight, or because you have said the right words, standing in my doorway. I did not come expecting it to," Tashi said. I only came because staying away any longer had started to feel worse than facing whatever was waiting here. Whatever you might say. Whatever silence might still be left between us, even after tonight. You may have to come back more than once, Karma said, plainly. One evening does not undo 6 years of teaching and however many years of silence after it. Then I will come back, Tashi said simply, as many times as it takes, and I will not wait for the road to feel easier before I do. Whatever the season, whatever excuse I might otherwise be tempted to make. They sat together at the bench a long while after that, not speaking of the years apart, simply working the wood side by side the way they once had, the shavings curling pale onto the floor between them, the old rhythm of 2 sets of hands finding each other again without needing further words to explain it. Perhaps you are holding something like Karma's stone tonight, some particular absence, some particular silence from someone who moved ahead of you and never quite looked back the way you hoped they might. Perhaps they have never returned to explain themselves, the way Tashi did, and perhaps they never will. You do not have to decide tonight whether it was fair. You only have to notice that you are permitted to set it down, the way Karma began to. Not because it stopped mattering, but because carrying it had stopped being the same thing as loving what it once was. There is a quiet difference between forgiving someone and pretending nothing happened, and Karma did not do the second thing that evening. He said plainly that his anger had not disappeared. He simply stopped requiring the anger to guard the door before anything warmer was allowed back through it. Sometimes, releasing resentment does not look like reconciliation at all. Sometimes, it only looks like 2 people working quietly beside each other again. Shavings falling between them, neither one needing the whole matter resolved before they are permitted to simply be near each other once more. The old wound acknowledged rather than argued away. This is worth naming clearly, because so many people wait for a full and tidy resolution before allowing themselves any peace at all, certain that letting go of resentment requires first winning back everything the resentment was protecting. An apology precise enough, an explanation complete enough. Karma received neither of those things in full that evening. What he received instead was simply presence, imperfect and overdue. And it turned out to be enough to loosen a grip he had held for years without ever once succeeding in loosening it through argument alone. Let your hands soften now around whatever old stone you have been carrying, whatever silence, whatever unanswered letter, whatever particular absence still carries its familiar weight. Let your shoulders lower, the weight settling out of them, the way dust settles once the air goes still, no longer stirred by the same old current of hurt. Let your chest loosen, gently, without needing an apology that may never come in order to finally let go. Without needing the other person to understand what it cost you in order for the cost to finally be set down. You do not have to forgive anyone tonight in the complete, tidy way stories sometimes promise. The way endings arrive, neatly wrapped in a tale, told for someone else's comfort. You are only asked to notice that you are allowed to stop guarding the door quite so tightly, even while the ache behind it remains exactly as real as it has always been. Let your jaw soften too. Unclench from the old argument it has been quietly rehearsing. The one that was never going to be won by rehearsing it again. Somewhere, a door carved long ago is still standing, still holding, made by hands that were never entirely their own, weathered by seasons it will never fully remember, admired by strangers who will never know the small mountain workshop where its first true lines were learned, or the old teacher whose patient corrections still live quietly inside every careful angle. Let your breath slow, longer on the way out than on the way in. And let whatever you have been carrying simply rest now, beside you, no longer gripped so tightly, no longer required to prove anything before you are allowed to sleep. Feel your whole body settling, heavier with each breath, the way wood shavings settle once the blade has finally stopped moving for the night. The workshop quiet, the fire low, nothing left to carve until morning. Rest now, hands open, nothing left to hold. The old stone set quietly down beside you, still there if you need it again tomorrow, but not tonight, not tonight. Karma set his old resentment down beside him that evening. Not gone, only no longer gripped. There is one more evening left tonight, and it asks nothing further of you than to simply arrive in it, the way water arrives at wherever it happens to be going, without hurry, without needing to announce itself first, without needing anyone standing on the bank to confirm that it has arrived correctly or on time. You have carried a great deal through these hours, a river of small lives, small aches, small mornings spent counting things that never needed counting, ferrymen and monks, weavers and widows, a woman with 2 lamps, and a man who finally set down an old cord. You do not need to carry anything more now. You do not even need to remember all of it clearly. What remains is only this, plain and unhurried. The way the last light on water remains plain and unhurried long after everything else about the day has gone quiet, long after the boats have stopped arguing about which of them traveled furthest. Let your body already begin to grow heavier here, sinking a little deeper into whatever is holding you. There is nothing left to learn tonight. There is only this, one last quiet crossing, and then rest. Many years after, a young ferryman first learned that he was always exactly where the water needed crossing. He was an old man still, working the very same short stretch of river, his hands slower now, his back a little more bent over the pole than it once had been, though the crossing itself had never once changed. 20 short lengths of water, back and forth, the same evening light falling across it the same way it always had, season after season. The years folding quietly into one another, the way seasons do for anyone who has simply kept showing up to the same small piece of work for long enough. He had married, in those years, a woman from the far bank, and raised 2 children who had grown and moved on to their own quiet lives in the wider city, visiting now only rarely, though the letters came steadily enough, and he had long since stopped measuring his own quiet contentment against whatever grander lives they might have imagined for him in his place. He had buried his own parents, and later a dear old friend from the Boatmen's Guild, and had come, slowly, without ever deciding to in any single dramatic moment, to understand his own small crossing as something closer to a completed life than an unfinished one. The evening bell sounded once, far off across the water, thinner now than it had been in his memory of that first year, though he could not have said whether the bell itself had changed or only his hearing of it, softened away. All sound softens with enough winters behind it. Nearer, the last boats of the day drifted past on the wider channel, small lanterns already lit at their bows, their reflections breaking and reforming on the moving surface. And closest of all, Wren felt the old mooring rope, worn smoother now than it had ever been, softened by decades of the same 2 hands, settling easily into his grip the way it always did at this hour, needing no thought at all to find its familiar place. The reeds along the bank had grown thicker over the years, and the dock itself had been repaired more times than he could easily count, plank by plank, until very little of the original wood remained, though it still felt, beneath his bare feet, exactly the way it always had. A young man had been coming to learn the crossing from him these past few months, quick enough, with the pole already, though still a little unsettled in his movements, the way Ren himself once had been, all those years ago, when he too had watched the wider boats pass and wondered whether his own small crossing would ever amount to anything worth speaking of. Ren had chosen him carefully from among several who had asked, not for his speed or his strength, which were ordinary enough for a young man his age, but for the quiet, patient way. He waited at the dock each morning, without checking to see who else had already arrived before him, without glancing anxiously toward the wider channel to measure his own morning against anyone else's. Do you ever wish you had gone somewhere else? All these years, the young man asked, watching a merchant boat glide past toward the wider water, its lanterns bright against the darkening sky, its wake spreading slow ripples across the still surface near the dock, the sound of it soft and unhurried against the hulls of the moored boats nearby. I did, truly, Ren said, his voice unhurried, matching the pace of the evening around them. For a long time. And now the young man asked, watching him closely. Ren did not answer right away. He watched the merchant boat's lanterns grow smaller, then watched, without needing to follow them any further, as they blurred into the general dark of the river, one small light among many, indistinguishable now from the rest. The water carried the last of the day's warmth up toward them, faint and familiar. Now I don't, he said simply, and meant it fully. The young man waited quietly, as though expecting more, some further explanation, some teaching passed down the way Ren's own understanding might once have arrived through careful words. When nothing more came, he seemed to understand slowly that nothing more was truly needed, that the answer had already been given in full, complete in its own quiet brevity. They finished tying up together in the fading light, the old motion and the new one moving side by side, unhurried, the rope passing between weathered hands and younger ones without either needing to hurry the other along. Ren sat a while afterward on the worn mooring post, the way he had most evenings for longer than he could easily count now, watching the last of the light fail over the water. The young man sat with him for a while too, quiet, not needing to fill the silence with anything further, before finally saying his goodnights and heading up the path toward the village, his footsteps fading slowly into the general hush of the evening, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it, too, dissolved into the ordinary quiet of the riverbank. Somewhere out past the bend, small lights kept drifting, some further than others, some catching for a while against the reeds before finding their way loose again, all of them bound, eventually, for the same wide, dark. Ren no longer watched to see how far any of them traveled. He simply watched them go, the way he watched his own breath rise and settle in the cooling evening air, each one its own small point of warmth against the gathering dark, none of them needing his attention in order to keep burning, none of them needing to arrive anywhere in particular before their light had already done everything it was ever meant to do. The water moved the same way it always had, unhurried, indifferent to the small dramas that had once played out across its surface in his own mind. The counting, the comparing, the quiet arithmetic he had once mistaken for paying attention. It simply carried what was given to it, at whatever pace each thing happened to travel, toward whatever shore it happened to be bound for, asking nothing further of any single lantern than that it burn for as long as it was able. He thought, briefly, of an old woman who had once told him something on this very water, decades ago now, her face already fading a little in his memory, though her words had somehow stayed clear and whole all these years. Worn smooth, the way the mooring rope had worn smooth, through nothing more than steady, patient use, evening after evening, year after year, until the smoothness itself had become indistinguishable from the rope. He did not need to recall her exact words tonight. They had long since stopped being words at all, and had simply become the way he sat here now, unhurried, at ease, needing nowhere else to be. The sky above the river had gone the deep blue-black of full evening now, the first faint stars beginning to show through where the last clouds had thinned. The air had cooled enough that Ren pulled his thin outer robe a little closer around his shoulders, though he made no move to rise from the mooring post just yet, content simply to sit a while longer, feeling the old wood beneath him, solid and familiar, the rope coiled quiet at his feet, the whole river settling, slowly, into the particular stillness that belonged only to this hour, the hour when the last of the light finally surrenders, and the water, no longer needing to reflect anything at all, simply becomes dark and calm and complete. Let your body settle now, the way the old ferryman's did, unhurried, complete, the whole long day finally set down. Let your shoulders rest against whatever is holding you, sinking a little deeper with each breath, the last of the day's small tensions loosening one by one, muscle by muscle, without you needing to help them along. Let your arms grow heavy, resting wherever they happen to be resting, needing nothing further from them tonight. No more reaching, no more holding, no more checking. Let your breath find its own quiet rhythm, in and out, needing nothing further from you. No correction, no adjustment, simply moving the way it has always known how to move, long before you ever thought to notice it, long before you ever thought to compare it to anyone else's breathing at all. Feel your chest rise, gently, and fall, gently, the same slow rhythm the river itself has kept for longer than anyone standing on its banks could ever remember. Longer than any single lantern, any single crossing, any single ordinary evening. Let your legs grow heavy too, the way tired legs grow heavy at the end of a long, ordinary day, sinking into whatever is beneath them, no longer needing to carry you anywhere else tonight. No further crossing left to make. Let your feet soften. Let your hands soften. Let your face soften. The small muscles around your eyes releasing whatever they have been quietly holding through the hours since you closed them. The small muscles around your jaw letting go of whatever they had been silently clenched around. There is nothing left to compare tonight. There is nothing left to count. There is only this breath, and the one after it, and the one after that, each one arriving in its own time, at its own pace, needing no other breath before or after it to prove that it belonged to you. Somewhere, a small light drifts on dark water, unhurried, unwatched, burning for exactly as long as it is able before quietly going dark. Somewhere, An old man sits a while longer on a worn wooden post before finally rising, slowly, to walk the short familiar path home. Somewhere, the evening simply continues, settling the way evenings always have, needing no one awake to witness it in order for it to be complete, needing no audience at all in order for it to have mattered. Let the soft dark settle in around you now, the way it settles over a river at the end of a long, ordinary day, deepening slowly, without hurry, without announcement. Let your mind grow quiet the way the water grows quiet once the last boat has finally passed and the current is left simply to move at its own unwatched pace, undisturbed, unhurried, exactly as it was always going to move. You do not need to hold on to anything further tonight. Whatever you carried into this evening, you are permitted to set it down here, gently, the way a rope is set down once the boat is finally, completely tied. Whatever remains unfinished can remain unfinished until morning. Whatever remains uncertain can remain uncertain a while longer. None of it requires your attention any longer tonight. None of it. Not one small thread of it. Rest now. Let sleep come the way the current comes, without your needing to reach for it, without your needing to hurry it along, without your needing to check how quickly it is arriving compared to any other night you have ever fallen asleep. It is already here, the way it has always been here, patient, unhurried, waiting only for you to stop searching for it elsewhere. Rest now. Somewhere tonight, that same small lantern is still drifting, further along the dark river now than it was when you first noticed it, though it never once hurried to get here. It has simply kept burning, at its own pace, the whole time you were listening. Tonight, you sat with a ferryman who stopped watching other boats, a cook who found fire he thought had gone out, a weaver who let one uneven row remain, a widow who stopped measuring grief by distance, a wood carver who set an old stone down without needing an apology first. All of it. In the end, the same simple water, carrying every one of them at exactly the pace they needed. You are not behind. There was never a shore up ahead where everyone else had already gathered, waiting, wondering where you were. There was only ever this current, moving at its own pace, carrying you exactly where you are, exactly when you are, needing nothing further from you in order to call this a completed life rather than an unfinished one. The lanterns that seemed, for a while, to be pulling ahead of yours were never actually racing you at all. They were simply burning, the way yours has been burning this whole time, each one lit by someone who once believed, just as you may have believed, that arriving somewhere mattered more than simply being here. Let that settle into you now, all the way down, past the thinking, into the body itself. You do not have to catch up to anyone tonight. You do not have to check how far the other lanterns have traveled. You are already here. You have been here the entire time, and being here was never the failure it sometimes felt like in the middle of an ordinary, difficult day. I will admit something before we close. I still have a box of old letters I rarely open, each one a reminder of a life I once expected and never lived. I no longer feel I owe it an explanation. Tomorrow will arrive at its own pace too, whatever that pace happens to be. You will not need to have caught up to anyone by the time it does. It will simply be another small light, set loose on the same wide water, asking only to be carried. If any of these stories found you tonight, in whatever room you are lying in, a quiet, like, or a moment, shared with someone else who might need it, helps this small light keep drifting to others as well. Let go now of anything you are still holding on to, still counting, still comparing. Let the current take it, gently, the way it takes everything eventually, without argument, without hurry. There is no race tonight. There never was. There is only this breath, and the dark, soft water, and rest.